Now it's time to hear from our international keynote speaker who will talk about the one-story city, a disabled vision of an urban future. Let's watch this presentation from author, designer, educator, and consultant, Professor David Gissen from the Parsons School of Design in New York City.
Hi, everyone. Sorry that I can't be with you all today. I have to finish my semester with my students here in New York City. I also want to apologize that I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is not quite what it usually is, but hopefully I can manage this presentation okay. So I want to thank the organizers of this conference for agreeing to let me share some of my thoughts with you about disability, cities, and architecture in this remote and recorded format. So when most people imagine how cities might transform to become more usable and accommodating for their disabled residents, they usually imagine the creation of design interventions that reduce the barriers that many disabled people experience in cities. This includes transformations like what you see here: a large curb cut in a city sidewalk with a red plastic tactile plates laid over it. So this, as you can see, this enables wheelchair users to move more easily between the grade change of a sidewalk and the street, which is generally lower. And as I mentioned, you also notice the red tactile inserts into the curb cut, and that also enable blind people to traverse the curb more easily. The small raised bumps in the red tactile plate can be felt with the foot or with the use of a cane, a very typical way that many blind and low vision people navigate urban space. So these type of accessible design interventions are important. They include things like the sidewalk I just showed you, but as well as things like this that you've all seen throughout cities, like this wheelchair accessible ramp. These kinds of interventions enable people who use wheelchairs, who are blind, or have difficulty ambulating in cities, greater ease in movement and mobility. As a disabled person, I often think about how cities might change relative to the experiences of their disabled citizens and beyond these type of typical disability accommodations. These other ideas, I believe, are more comprehensive and in some ways even more radical from the perspectives of non-disabled people. Many of these alternative ideas challenge some of the physical characteristics that we associate with a modern city. For example, today, I want to take you through what we might call a disabled fantasy of a city, and that was actually shared by many other modern architects throughout history. And that fantasy that I want to examine with you today is the fantasy of the one-story city. So for over 150 years, most histories of cities and the architecture within them argue that a modern city is an inherently tall and rising, ascendant city. This is a photograph. What you're seeing here is a photograph from one of the first exhibitions on modern architecture at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City from almost 100 years ago. This exhibition narrated the history of construction technology in the American city of Chicago, Illinois. Its curator, Philip Johnson, argued that as the buildings in cities became increasingly built out of steel versus brick, that the buildings within them would become larger, taller, and more open to their surroundings. You can see that in this display of models of buildings, and that shows a 7-story brick building on the left and a 20-story steel building on the right. And all of us are familiar with this kind of narrative. Modern materials enable the city to get taller and taller and taller. This idea that a city, a region, or even a continent's buildings become taller over time is what we call in the United States conventional wisdom. It's something so inherently true and believable as to be unquestionable. This is a simple diagram that narrates the ever-increasing height of buildings in Asia, and in the context of a real estate conference, which you're all attending, I imagine this is a belief shared by many of you as well, that this is the future of the city. The city gets taller and taller. But I would argue that it's not entirely the case. Let me give you a few counterexamples before moving on to the main topic of my talk. There's no clear arc, or what historians call historical arc, that suggests that cities simply become taller and taller and more massive architecturally. For example, for millennia, societies with traditions of large-scale monumental building self-consciously built entire precincts out of lower and less massive buildings. They did this not because they lacked resources, but because they wanted to create urban precincts that were built around other values: intimacy, family, intergenerational living, being close to the ground, and the kind of commerce of the ground, among many other ideas. Among the most famous examples of this global phenomena might be the hutangs that you see here, many of which were built hundreds of years after multi-story construction techniques were improved and in some cases perfected out of wood in mainland China. If people could build multi-story buildings, why would they build only one-story ones? This is an interesting and ongoing question that I often have. And as many of you know, for hundreds of years, these districts held multi-generational worlds within them, and only a few of these areas remain and are preserved today. Again, conventional wisdom suggests that the development of modern construction techniques with concrete, lightweight masonry, and steel beams and columns enable architects to build taller and taller buildings, and that this was an inherent and desirable goal. But architects inserted other values or physical possibilities within these materials. Maybe one of the most famous, at least in the United States, is Frank Lloyd Wright. He was an architect who explored how steel could enable the construction of longer versus taller buildings. This is a one-story side wing of his Ward Willits house outside Chicago. And what's interesting about this building is that this long, low wing that you see here that held the living spaces of the house is actually held up with a very long steel beam, and that allows for a continuous row of windows below it. So all I'm trying to mention here is that there's no inherent architectural character to innovative materials, that advances in construction technology can enable all kinds of physical possibilities for buildings beyond what we've been taught and told. So this, as another example, is a city designed out of reinforced concrete by the French architect Tony Garnier. Now, interestingly, Garnier was less interested in using concrete to create tall buildings and instead explored how the technology could be used to more easily create one-story buildings. One of the interesting things about this image is the landscape that you see. One of the things that you may notice is that for Garnier, one-story building not only enables a city that's close and low to the ground, something that's obviously desirable for disabled people like myself, but notice how he also suggests that a one-story city would be filled with large trees. If the buildings in a city are lower, then the nature within them is more exposed to sun and rain, and of course, the vegetation within them would become more vibrant than the kind of somewhat frail vegetation that we see in very large cities like New York City today. So this is an interior view showing what is generally the step-free layout of the interior of these particular spaces. The idea of a one-story city was something that several modern architects imagined specifically for disabled people. So this is a fairly crude drawing, but an interesting drawing, by the architect Adolf Loos, a Czech architect working in Vienna that I'm sure many of you have heard of. So Loos was one of the most famous modern architects in Vienna, Austria at the time that he drew this. And incidentally, many people are unaware that Adolf Loos was disabled. He was almost completely deaf. And immediately after World War I, he devoted his practice to designing buildings for Austria's disabled war veterans. So this sketch, this kind of odd little house that you see here, was a one-story building design that he designed for war veterans. That was one story, was low to the ground, could be used by somebody who was a disabled veteran, but it also could be built easily by its inhabitant. This is one of his ideas. And here in this next slide, you'll see a photo of several veterans constructing another one-story house in the same part of Vienna, Austria. So he was very interested not just in making buildings that were low to the ground, that would be easier to use for people that had mobility impairments, that were wounded from the war, but they could also build easily by making them out of simple and modern building materials. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the work of the German-American architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and who developed numerous designs for glass-walled steel skyscrapers throughout the Americas. On the right is one of his most famous built projects, the Seagram's Building on Park Avenue in New York City. And on the left is a model that he designed of one of the very first glass and steel skyscrapers, and it's from the 1920s. He sort of invented the idea of the steel and glass skyscraper about 100 years ago. So what many people don't know, or what I think is very interesting, is at the same time that Mies van der Rohe was examining the use of steel to create tall buildings, he also examined how steel and masonry could be combined to create entire urban districts with one-story steel, masonry, and glass structures, like the one you see here. Again, this is kind of like an apartment building, but one that's scattered over one story on an urban lot. Again, these ideas were developed in the wake of World War I, and they offered a more kind of gentle idea of urban development after the war, rather than kind of a massive multi-story apartment buildings like many other kinds of modern architects that were Mies's contemporary proposed. So here's a plan of these, and that's showing large, open one-story plans for each residence. It's a kind of block laid out, shown in plan, as well as courts and numerous large trees within them. You can also see how he's experimenting with the division of property within a block. And you'll notice how the division of the different lots is very different from the usual kind of grid arrangement that we see in many cities, like here in New York City. So after World War II, many architects revived the ideas of the one-story city, but to somewhat different ends. In Europe, one-story village designs were developed as part of the new welfare state, and often for housing elderly people. So this is a one-story apartment development created for elderly people in the Netherlands by the architect Herman Hertzberger. And I very much like this photograph, which emphasizes the incorporation of Hertzberger's design of incorporation of a place for people to rest within this scheme. You can kind of see that on the left with these benches outside of each apartment, and this kind of quote-unquote Dutch door. That's what we call a door that opens on the top and the bottom, like you see in this photograph, and enables people to talk. And as we know, as we get older, we don't have the capacity to walk as well as we once did, and so things like this really acknowledge that kind of transformation to our bodies as well as our needs. So this is a photograph from the development soon after it was constructed, and here's a contemporary view, and it shows pretty much the same idea, but also just how well maintained this complex is. Okay. So outside Europe, architects often turn to one-story urban plans as a way to revive pre-European and pre-colonial architectural and urban traditions. In Egypt, the architect Hassan Fatih developed one-story urban plans using traditional building materials like earth and brick for several different designs, including parts of his city design of New Gorna that you see here. And you can see his idea of the one-story city here in these beautiful drawings that were done by him, as well as his idea of designing the city in a way that kind of challenges the strict gridded layouts of many colonial era plans, and something that tries to recuperate pre-colonial ideas of urban space. Here's another view of one of the arcades within Norgorna. You can see how it uses traditional construction, just how beautiful it all is. So moving to the present, today architects continue to experiment with one-story urban plans, and for a variety of reasons, many of which were similar to those in the past. This includes the desire to create more accessible cities for disabled people, to preserve historic building traditions, to create more connections between people and nature. So what you see here is a model of a housing scheme for elderly people by the architect Junya Ishigami, a Japanese architect. And his idea here is that he wanted to create a dense village out of traditional Japanese frame buildings. Many of these structures were individual frame houses that were scheduled to be demolished to make way for larger multi-scale buildings. But Ishigama proposed to preserve, move, and reuse these wooden structures that were supposed to be destroyed and to reassemble them into this urban plan, this little village that you see here. Ishigama wanted to create an accessible housing project that did not feel clinical, like a hospital or a typical kind of elder care facility that's often made for elderly people. Here you can see a plan of the development and just how kind of beautiful and intimate and interesting it is in terms of the kinds of spaces it makes and the kinds of world that it would make for elderly people. So here's another contemporary example. This is a recently completed one-story co-working office complex in Los Angeles. You can see these relatively small circular rooms, all of which are one story tall. And this particular architect filled an entire block with these kind of one-story office pods. And the architects of this complex not only created a fully accessible office environment, but they built a complex in which each office enjoys an abundance of nature around it. And here you can see a view of one of the interiors of the office pods. And this was designed to be, this is a pre-pandemic design and was designed to be used in a kind of WeWork scenario in which freelancers or smaller companies would rent out these pods for their use to have meetings like you see here, or as places to work versus kind of more permanent purpose-built office space. Really interesting idea. Finally, I realize that I'm talking in the context of a real estate conference, so I want to address how the one-story city relates to property development. I realize many of you probably think that one-story buildings are uneconomical, but I would actually disagree. In the United States, some of the most interesting experiments with property development are happening with one-story buildings. For example, in California, a state where I was based for many years, many cities in California have passed new laws enabling owners of single-family residential lots to build what are called accessory dwelling units on their property. In the United States, we call them ADUs for short. That's the acronym for accessory dwelling units. And these accessory buildings are typically very small apartments generating additional income for their owners, and almost all are only one story tall. They're typically built in the back lot, like you see here, but in some cities in California, they're enabling them to be built in the front part of the front yard of a property or the front part of the lot. Although this is rarely discussed in writing about accessory dwelling units or ADUs, the construction of these has actually greatly increased the physical accessibility of residential buildings in cities. The number of buildings, residential buildings and units and apartments that can now be rented by disabled people has often increased with the emplacement of policies and economic incentives of owners to build these on their property. So these are some examples, all of which were built in the US very recently. So typically, ADUs are associated with younger residents or with use by people who want to rent out properties with companies like Airbnb, but ADUs may also enable more opportunities for aging in place and non-institutional forms for housing elderly people or those who may need increased forms of home care. So for example, if you're an elderly person, you may ultimately choose to live in an accessory dwelling like this, and perhaps the owners or one of the services the owners offers is the ability to tend to you in some way. I don't mean to care for you in the way that one would have care in an elderly housing facility, but perhaps when somebody goes get groceries, those are available. Or if somebody needs a ride to a bus station or to a grocery store, that becomes available as part of the kind of arrangement or community they have within the particular area in which they live, or the parcel of which they're on. So to sum all of this up, we often believe that cities will simply become taller and taller over time. That's how they become more modern, right? They become bigger and more massive. But a disabled perspective on cities also shows us how progress and ideas about the future also include any number of ways to bring the scale of cities down a bit too. And I just want to end with this wonderful series of workshops that I engaged with in students here in the United States. So on the left are some graduate architecture students of mine from here in New York City at the Parsons School of Design. On the right are some undergraduate students that I worked with recently at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So in both cases, I asked my students to reimagine cities in a one-story form. And just want to share these projects with you because they're quite a bit of fun. And if any of you are interested in me staging this, either at your communities, your workplaces, or the universities you may have associations with, I'd be more than happy to do this. So for example, on the left, I had each of my students select a very controversial multi-story building here in New York City. Everything from needle apartment towers that are almost 100 stories tall to more recent controversial multi-story buildings like Thomas Heatherwick's Vessel at Hudson Yards. Each of them had to take this building and reimagine it in a one-story form. That's what you see on the left in this large model that they made, and on the right you can see in the original. And on the right side, a very similar exercise, I had students at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville reimagine their entire campus in a one-story form. Now, what I've noticed in developing these is that as much as architects and young designers want to imagine a future that's kind of bigger and taller and more engineered than the one of the past, they absolutely have a great time imagining ways to bring the city down a bit and figuring out ways to create a kind of new kind of scale of urbanization, something that I'm very excited for and excited for the future. Thank you very much for letting me speak with you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.